Good evening, aviation enthusiasts. Welcome back to another episode of Ask an Ambassador. Tuesday, June 28th, I'm pretty sure. I'm Jamie Beckett, AOPA Foundation You Can Fly Ambassador for the East Coast, and shortly I'm going to be joined by my good friends Pat Brown and Kay Sundrum. But first, I've got to set the scene. And of course, we have to thank Rebecca Boone, who is the producer of this episode, making everything happen. Her predecessor, Donnie, used to very often do this from a secure bunker at the foot of Mount Rushmore. Donnie has moved on to bigger and better things temporarily. Rebecca, lots of class. She does this program from a very sophisticated tea room in Alexandria, Virginia. So if you hear some clinking china, that's Rebecca and her crew. But what we're going to talk about tonight is temporary flight restrictions and intercept procedures. This is something that many of us would like to put out of our mind because for most of us, when we started flying, this wasn't a thing. It certainly wasn't when I started. But in the post 9/11 world, TFRs, temporary flight restrictions, are a real thing. And they come in a variety of sizes, dimensions, and flavors, all the way from very small, almost unimportant TFRs that are just keeping you out of a trouble spot to VIP TFRs at the other end of the spectrum that are protecting somebody that really does need protection. I'd like to bring in my buddies Pat Brown and Kay Sundrum, and let me set the scene as we get this discussion going, Pat and Kay. And of course, as always, the audience can ask about anything they want. We're goofy enough to answer, but let's set the scene for this. And tell me if this sounds familiar to you. It's an absolutely beautiful morning. Summer is upon us. It's a nice, cool morning. The sky is clear. The winds are light. It's just perfect for flying. I go out to the airport and I'm going to go out for lunch. Maybe I'm going to take somebody with me. And I'm going someplace I've been 100 times before, so I don't need to call anybody. I don't need to check anything. I can look up and see the weather's fantastic. And I'm flying to my destination. I'm maybe 30, 40 miles out from home, just having a wonderful time. And all of a sudden, right over here on my left side, an F-16 goes zipping by or a military helicopter pops up. This is indicative of a problem, isn't it, Kay?
Absolutely. I cannot say that I've had that experience, but I do know that that can happen. And we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about how not to be in that situation, right?
Yeah, and that's the key, really, Pat, isn't it? Because while these can be very serious infractions, and we'll talk about possible penalties down the road here, but they're so easy to avoid. Not invading a TFR is so simple. It's almost amazing anybody does it, don't you think?
Yeah, it's just a matter of a telephone call, and we'll talk a little bit about electronic flight bags and things like that a little bit later. You betcha.
Yeah, Chris Ruff asks a really good question. Is there a minimum amount of time between the announcement of a TFR and when it goes into effect? You know, because of the nature of TFRs, not always. Generally, they're pretty good. As a matter of fact, we were just talking about this a little while ago because we actually planned this show. There's about to be a TFR in my neighborhood because there will be a SpaceX launch tomorrow. And it's a fairly large TFR that pops up because of that. The restricted areas go hot. But, you know, one of the things I want to really get people thinking about as we talk about this, Kay and Pat, is we might think this is not a very common thing. And I took a couple notes. In the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, there were 73 TFR violations. That's a big number. In January 2018, a Grumman Tiger violated a presidential TFR over Wilmington, Delaware. And I'm sorry, that was May 2021. A Grumman Tiger violated a presidential TFR over Wilmington, Delaware. That's Joe Biden. In September 2021, proving this can happen to anybody, an Army flight instructor flying an Army-owned Cessna 182 violated a VIP temporary flight restriction in New York City. The airplane was owned by West Point. and that was a violation. And on June 4th, 2022, just at the beginning of this month, President Biden was actually evacuated from his beachfront home because a general aviation aircraft flew through the TFR, totally oblivious. They're not on the frequency. They didn't pay attention. Pat, can you imagine the excitement when they've actually had to evacuate the president because they don't know what you're doing, and you're flying along all fat, dumb, and happy? Those fighters show up. They really don't have a sense of humor about this. Do you imagine?
No, they don't. I mean, it's funny for us to sit here on the ground in the safety of our homes and laugh about this. But I can assure you, if that happened in the real world, I can't imagine what my blood pressure would have looked like.
Yeah, you know, Kay, I think the thing people forget, because we become so accustomed to flight and so accustomed to those traditional routes, places we go. You go to Big Bear, I go to Sebring or Gainesville frequently. We get so used to those, and we lull ourselves into complacency where we don't make that phone call, and we don't realize the severity of how this is viewed by the people who are charged with protecting somebody they're putting that TFR around. So this really is a big deal, don't you think?
It's a very big deal. You know, you said that word complacency. I like to emphasize that word because I think we're all a little prone to that. And the way we get around it is having a mindset that, okay, I'm not going to just take these shortcuts. Yes, I've done this flight 100 times, but I'm still going to follow, you know, the safe processes that are in place to keep you out of trouble. So the complacency, we got to really be conscientious of not falling into that trap, because that'll get even the most experienced pilots into big trouble.
I was scheduled to do a flight review with a fellow once in a Cessna 150, a very nice airplane, but not the most capable airplane in the world. And on the day when we were supposed to do the flight, the wind was gusting to like 25, which is pretty high for a 150. And there was a presidential TFR in Orlando, and that TFR ends about 9 miles from the end of our runway. So it's not right there, but you can't stray too far to the north. And we finished up the oral, and I asked him what he thought. He says, well, we're booked, so we can go. And it was like, well, hold on. Just because we're booked, we're not going. And you've got to put these things in your thought process: the weather, the state of the aircraft, your own health and attitude, and how everything's going. And are there things like TFRs out there? Chris Ruff comes back with another good question. What's the most lead time they give before they go into effect? Rebecca, can you pop up that graphic that Pat provided with the FAA TFR page? There actually is a web page, and Pat, I'd like you to address this just for a moment, if you would. That's available to anyone where they can see what's coming up in the future in their area, can't they?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, if you take a look at that red arrow that we superimposed there, if you go to tfr.faa.gov, this is the page that you come up with. And if you want to sort by different types of NOTAMs, because there are several of them. There are just hazard NOTAMs, security NOTAMs, there's air show and sports NOTAMs, space operations like you've got coming, and special NOTAMs. You can click on that little box right there, and a drop-down box will show up, and you can select the one that you want, or you can just leave it there, all NOTAMs, and then go. But if you do that, boy, I tell you what, you could be reading a long time. So if you can select the state, you can select the center. If you take a look at the graphic right there, there's a lot of ways that you can parse that information. But if you don't want to talk to somebody, and shoot, some folks just don't like to talk on the telephone. And if you don't have an EFB, an electronic flight bag with an app that displays them, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later, then this is certainly one way that you can go and figure it out. So yeah, very easy.
Rebecca, if you could keep that up just for a moment, there are a number of different flavors of TFRs, and they have a wide range. The third one down there, which is for today, June 28th, It's in Mineral Wells, Texas, and that's a hazard. Now, I'm going to guess, Pat, and if we click on that 2/5488, we would know for sure. That very well may be venting of gas. That's not an uncommon one. And if we look at that TFR, it's not even very high. It might only go up to 1,000 feet. I assume you see those where you are, Pat. I certainly see them here now and then.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we went to Food to Lunch a few weeks ago, and there were 3 TFRs in our direct route of flight for gas releases. They were up to 1,000 feet, a mile or 2 in diameter. I've forgotten now, but easy enough to fly over. Certainly easy enough to fly around. They weren't very big, but they sure as heck were there, big red circles. So, once again, I mean, I'm alluding to the electronic flight bag, but they typically will show up there.
Yeah, and Kay, if you look at
mention
the
one
bottom.
Sorry,
I'm sorry, Kay?
I wanted to mention one other thing on this graphic that I like is, for me, that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I like to look at the maps. And if you see at the top, they have the TFR list, but they also have a TFR map. And if you click that, you can really zoom in on, you can go by center or you can go by state, and then zooming even further to your airport area. Right now, that map airports button is not working, but I do like the TFR map right on this website. And then of course we're going to talk about use of your iPad and other devices, but the graphical representation to me is a great way to just visualize where it is relative to my flight path.
And I was going to mention, Kay, you were just in Hawaii, and the second one up from the bottom there, again for today, 2/5434 is for a Hawaii site. It's a security TFR, which could be a political event. It could be the governor or whatever. But you were just in Hawaii, and Hawaii is different than the rest of the United States because it is a series of islands. But still, this is something you really need to be aware of before you launch off to your destination, don't you think?
Absolutely. And in a place like in Hawaii, where if you have a big TFR, you may not be able to go anywhere at all. And that's true in the mainland also, but you got to take a look at the multiple different TFRs that might be in effect, and when they are in effect, what altitudes, and whether you can get by. You don't want to be zigzagging through if there is a series of TFRs. It could be pretty complicated to navigate that way. So instances like that, especially if it was in Hawaii and there's multiple TFRs, I'll just stay put until that TFR goes away.
Yeah, I like that planning as well. Go ahead, Pat.
I was just going to ask Kay. I said, I want you to call. I want you to get that Hawaiian TFR taken care of because I'm going to be there tomorrow.
Oh, that's right.
I don't want any problems flying around the island.
Well, by the way, Chris Ruff comes back and he says, I just look at the TFR map. Is that sufficient? Chris, I'm going to have you make that decision yourself by the end of this episode. And it is important that you make that decision yourself because Pat, Kay, and I aren't always going to be here for you, although we want to be. We just have stuff going on. By the way, for those of you watching, give me a thumbs up emoji if you've ever encountered a TFR, if it ever impacted your flight plans, if you ever popped up one in flight, if you ever accidentally violated one. Give me a thumbs up in the comments, and maybe we can talk about that. Pat, we were talking a little earlier about there are so many different types of TFRs. It's important to know that they're active, but it's also important to know what is it? That hazard TFR out by Mineral Wells, for instance, that might only go up to 1,000 feet, where later on in July, there's going to be a TFR over AirVenture and Oshkosh, and that's probably going to go to 10,000 feet or so because of the air show. This really is a three-dimensional thing we have to consider on a case-by-case basis, isn't it?
Yeah, and obviously knowing what kind they are will allow you the strategy to figure out how you can fly through them. For example, a sports stadium TFR, or in the case of, and again, we can talk about this in more detail later, but you both have Disney properties out where you live, and I've got the Astros have their stadium here in Houston, and when that TFR is active, it pretty much cuts off the VFR corridor between the east and west side of town. There's a mile or two maybe that you can squeeze through. But in our TFR, if you're talking to ATC and squawking a code, you can fly through it. You can't circle around and take pictures of the Minute Maid Park, but you can fly through it, and perfectly happy to allow you to do that. I assume that's the same with the TFRs you guys have.
Well, I was going to ask Kay about that, as a matter of fact, because we both have Disney properties right near us, which do have permanently charted temporary flight restrictions. I love the irony of that. But Kay, a lot of people do believe you can't fly through a TFR for any reason, but you actually can, even VFR, can't you?
Yeah, sometimes you can. For example, the Disneyland that is in Anaheim in the Los Angeles area is, yes, like you said, it's called a temporary flight restriction, but it's basically a permanent flight restriction, and it goes up to 3,000 feet. It's about 3 miles, and it's not very big. However, you can go through that if you have flight following. Now, when I first moved out here to Southern California, and I was a little overwhelmed with the airspace, even though I had flown in New York and San Francisco and DC. This area is special, and I remember being on flight following, and the controller said, "All right, this heading." I was going to, I believe it was Fullerton Airport, and that was the most direct route. And I just looked at it, and I questioned the controller. I just said, hey, "This heading is going to put me through the Disneyland VFR. I want it to be on the record." And is that correct? I wanted to make sure that I wasn't making a mistake, and that was the procedure. If you have flight following, you can go through that TFR. Now, I found out later on that that's normal procedure, but if you're here new to the area and you haven't flown with an instructor, you don't, that happens a lot. We don't always go to the same places again and again, and then you won't know about that. And if that's the case, ask the controller. Don't be shy about it, and don't assume that the controller is going to navigate you around all the TFRs, because that's not their responsibility. Their responsibility is to separate IFR traffic, right? And help you on a workload permitting basis. So if you're not sure, you need to speak up and ask.
I remember the first time.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Pat.
That's all right, Jamie. I'm sorry. I remember the first time that I encountered that TFR around the ballpark at Houston here. I was talking to ATC, and I said, "Can you vector me around it?" They said, "No, you're talking to us. You can go through it." And I said, say that again. And he said, "No, you're talking to us. You can go through it." And my reply to him was, "I'm glad. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I had that on tape." So,
well, we're not alone. We got Max has had the experience. Jose, Jennifer Johnson, who is undoubtedly wearing her AOPA hat right now. Martin Kastenbaum. So we're not alone in this. And Kay, I've had the exact same experience you did with the Disney World TFR here in Florida. The direct route from my home airport to Orlando exec runs right through that TFR. And I was on VFR flight flying, and my course was going to take me right through it. And that first time I was doing it, I called up the controller and said, "Verifying I'm cleared through the Disney TFR." They said affirmative. And that's the whole thing. If you've got a squawk code and you're on VFR flight flying, you're good to go through some TFRs, not all. So always verify if you're not sure. And Pat, at the high watermark of all this TFR stuff, you've actually flown through a presidential TFR. Can you tell us how you managed that without going to jail?
Yeah, but before, let me just reply quickly to Jose. He says, replying to Jennifer Johnson about his home airport being near a stadium. In Dallas, the Rangers play in Arlington, and the Arlington Stadium, they call it the ballpark, is very close to the Arlington airport. And when they're playing a game, the TFR, depending on which way the wind is blowing, you're going to fly through the TFR to land there. As long as you're talking to the tower, it's not a big deal. And regarding the presidential TFR, this was several years ago. I don't remember which president, but it was one of them anyway. They were here in Houston, and the TFR, the 30-mile ring, encompassed my home airport, India Whiskey Sierra, and very close to the airport that I had to go to for a business meeting. And I was darned if I was going to let a president stop me from flying. So I filed an IFR flight plan, and it was a non-event. And I was not inside that little 10-mile no-fly shoot you down ring, but I was on the 30-mile ring. Filed an IFR flight plan. I picked up my my clearance on the ground at the RCO at our airport. And normally they tell you to squawk a particular code. And if you forget to do it, ATC will remind you when you check in with them as you're climbing out. This time, no less than 3, maybe 4 times, the controller said, be sure you're squawking that code before you take off. Yes, sir, got that. Be sure you're squawking that code before you take off. And like I said, he reminded me several times to do that, but it was a non-event. And then coming home, just the reverse was true. I got my clearance at the other airport and flew back home. The one thing that was different coming home was that the president had moved closer to my home airport, and that 10-mile no-fly ring was about 3 miles or so to the east of our field. It's a left-hand traffic pattern, which would have put me very, very close to that red, the real dark red one. So I just opted to fly a right-hand traffic pattern, which, under the circumstances, was probably the prudent thing to do. There was literally nobody in the air. Everybody's scared to fly. And I was the only one there, but flying a right-hand traffic pattern in that particular case was probably more prudent than busting the TFR. So that's what I did. It was not a big deal. You just have to know.
Like you used some very good pilot and command decision-making skills there, Pat. I would have gone with the right-hand pattern as well.
Yeah.
Kay, the maddening part of this, because it does happen a lot and it does have serious consequences in some cases, it's so easy to prevent yourself from going into a TFR. It really starts with the simplicity of pre-flight planning, doesn't it?
Yes, that is the best way to avoid the TFR, is to go ahead and get that thorough pre-flight planning and make sure that you know what is along your route. So you can use so many different tools. I think most of us these days, we do fly with an iPad, or we have our iPhone or Android or some sort of handheld device, if it's not already panel mounted. All right, so there's some cost-effective ways. You don't have to have thousands of dollars of worth of equipment in your airplane or in a rental. You can buy some of the handheld devices, and you can do all your pre-flight planning in that and take a look at where the TFRs are. And these days, you can know even 24 hours ahead of time, the TFRs will be coded in yellow, letting you know, okay, this is going to become hot in 24 hours. And then when it is active, it'll be red. So it should be no surprise. And then you just follow your flight around that TFR. The other thing is the telephone number, 1-800-WEATHER-BRIEF, or you could go online, same thing, 1-800-WEATHERBRIEF.com, and you can get all this information, same on AOPA's website. So the excuse, well, I didn't know that this TFR popped up, is not going to be very good if you end up getting a violation, because there is a lot of information. Now, I will admit that sometimes these TFRs pop up, and we at AOPA have fought for a long time to ensure that pilots are provided detailed information, quality information in a timely fashion so that we can be compliant. And with these graphical TFRs, especially given to us ahead of time, and our ability to call flight service and check just for the NOTAMs, we really don't have a good excuse for not knowing that there is a TFR. So it comes down to pre-flight planning. That is extremely critical. And then the second piece of it is situational awareness. You always need to know exactly where you are and how far away you are from the TFR. And then the other piece of it is monitor the guard frequency, 121.5 also. Those are the suggestions that I have as far as pre-flight planning. Get the proper equipment, make sure that you're looking through it. Call 1-800-WEATHER briefing right before you're about to launch off. I hear a lot of people say, yeah, I got the weather briefing a couple hours ago. But what I encourage you do is actually call right before you're about to start up, just to check for TFRs. In my neck of the woods, they pop up a lot. We have a lot of special use airspace and military operations. A lot of TFRs pop up. And so you want to check right before you're going to start the engine. Even if you got a thorough weather briefing an hour, that's still too long, because TFRs do pop up, and it's your responsibility to know right before you start that engine.
Yeah, I kind of developed a habit some time ago where if I'm leaving the traffic pattern, I at least get an abbreviated briefing. And I tend to use ForeFlight and all those tools, and I gather all kinds of information. So I know pretty much what I'm doing and what I need to know. But I get the abbreviated briefing specifically out of paranoia. I know they're supposed to tell me about NOTAMs and TFRs, but I specifically ask about them on the tape. So I have an answer that I said, this is my route of flight. Are there any NOTAMs or TFRs I need to be aware of? And if they come back and list a couple NOTAMs for lights out or a crane in the vicinity and no TFRs, great. That's on the tape. So if something pops up while I'm on my way, I'm covered. The situational awareness thing you mentioned, Kay, is so important because we can over time fall into the habit of I'm just going out flying and I'm going generally eastbound or northbound and I know there's nothing there. I'm going to be fine and I'll find my way home. But if you didn't know about that TFR, you could certainly stray within the ring and not be aware of it. And because some of these are low altitude, yeah, maybe you're just flying along in a T craft at 1,000 feet and you cut through the top of something. It's still out there. Now, Pat, Kay brought up an interesting thing about monitoring guard 121.5. And sure, that might be for the soap opera entertainment value of hearing the other guy get nabbed. But it also might be the way they contact you if you're the one who's strayed into the territory, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. 121.5. But it's important to monitor that really for more than just that. We were flying to I think it was Sun and Fun back in April, and monitoring guard, and there was a beacon going off. ATC actually asked us if it was getting louder or softer as we flew along, and actually gave us a vector a couple of times asking if it was getting louder or softer. So sometimes you can actually be a help to ATC if you're monitoring guard too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely true. By the way, just for the educational value, if you go on YouTube, and some of you are watching on YouTube right now, so stay there, continue watching this. But when it's over, go check out TFR violations. And you will find the military, if it's a presidential TFR and they actually call up military, helicopters or fighters, they'll call on 121.5 to try and get your attention because they don't want to open fire on you. They actually want you to get out of the area. But if you're not monitoring, and there are some almost painful to watch videos where there's call after call after call, and these pilots just are not aware that they've strayed into a place they're not supposed to be, and they're not monitoring anything. So it really can get you. Now, we've alluded to penalties a couple times. So, Kay, limiting yourself to just the criminal aspect of this, if I was to violate a presidential TFR, what might I be looking at when I get to court? And yeah, it might go to court.
Well, you could end up with a $50,000 fine. You could end up with your certificate being revoked or suspended, and could be administrative action if it's not as serious, and that could be just a warning letter or letter of correction. But if you're actually in court, then it's not an administrative action. It's going to be a lot more severe, and so it could you could lose your pilot's license and pay a lot of fees and possibly even end up in jail.
Yeah. It's, for a presidential TFR, it can be up to a year in federal prison. No kidding around. Right. That's not the county lockup. Up to $100,000 fine. And Pat, as an examiner, you may be familiar with the 709 ride aspect of this. You really can get a suspension or a flat-out revocation, can't you?
Yeah, not only that, but there's civil penalties that you could be assessed civil penalties on top of that $100,000 fine and that jail term. So, let's just say that it was a relatively minor thing, and you just got you got a slap on the wrist, but the local FSDO certainly is within their purview to ask for what they call 709 ride. If those of you who are listening and watching haven't heard of that, that's basically a retest, a recheck. You're going to have to go fly with somebody to verify that you're competent to hold a pilot certificate. And that somebody isn't going to be somebody like me. It's going to be someone from the FSDO. So you really want to avoid a 709 ride if you can. Yeah.
Yeah, and unlike the old days where we could just turn our transponder off or not talk on the radio, we have ADS-B now. And most aircraft have that. They know who you are. They know where you're going. And you're not going to slip out of this. They take this really, really seriously. By the way, Tiffany Sams makes an interesting point. I've seen SpaceX launches, she says, having to delay due to GA aircraft violating the TFR. I've seen it as well. And unfortunately, spending the better part of my life here in Central Florida, the government actually has aircraft that are patrolling the perimeter of the restricted area TFR during space launches, because you really don't want to be there when they light that rocket, and they sure don't want you in the way. So somebody will be coming to talk to you, no doubt about it. Now, Rebecca, we've got a graphic, if you could pop up, that shows some intercept procedures. If you are unfortunate enough to violate a presidential TFR, they actually do have a method of coming after you. And here's one of them, of the in-flight intercept procedures. If this is based on F-16s, it also might be helicopters, but if the way they'll generally do this is the aircraft will pull up on the left side of your aircraft, because pilots either sit in the center or on the left side. So on the left side, they know you've got a good view. But there's also one behind you, because they don't know why you're there or what you're doing. They're going to break away. That aircraft on the left is going to break away. They want you to follow them. Rebecca, do we have another graphic of this same sort of thing? There we go. That's excellent. They're going to try to give you some basic communication, let's say. Kay, how would you describe that? How are they going to try and communicate with an errant pilot as they try and get you back on the straight and narrow?
Well, hopefully they, when they come up to your side, you're going to see them, and they'll get closer, and they'll be loud, and they're going to be in your face, literally. And so that should catch your attention. And then they're going to try to communicate with you by, rocking their wings, and you would want to respond by acknowledging them by doing the same thing. So if they break off to the left, and they're trying to give you a heading that they want you to follow. So you want to take their moves very seriously and then comply.
Yeah, and Pat, Russell McDonald's got a really interesting comment here. I like it a lot. He's a CFII, and he always pulls up the ForeFlight map and checks out the current location and route for TFIs as he's flying with students. That's a great way to pass along the message to students and clients as you fly with them. This is not something to be taken lightly. We don't have to panic about it, but we want to be gathering that information and be aware of what's going on. And I got to commend Russell. Do you have any comments on your in-flight process? Do you update as you go?
Yeah, we've kind of been dancing around the EFB thing, but ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, WingX, the major apps all show TFRs. I'm not as familiar with Garmin and some of the others as I am ForeFlight, but certainly ForeFlight, a day or a day and a half before the TFR turns red, it's there in yellow. So if you have the TFR selection on ForeFlight selected, then those things show up, and they're remarkably accurate. I will say one caveat is in terms of that accuracy, though. The distances on these TFRs are measured by radar, not by the GPS that's on your device. So if you're flying really, really close to a TFR, you might be in it and not know it, because you're looking at ForeFlight or some other device, and the folks that make those judgments are looking at radar. And how accurate is that radar? Don't know.
We talk about that in Rusty Pilots when we talk about prohibited areas, for instance. Give those a wide berth. Don't be that person with the GPS going, I'm a good 100 yards outside that TFR. No, that's not going to fly. That could be a problem, and you don't want to deal with it. Now, Bernard C. brings up an interesting point. He says basic communication is fire a short burst over the bow. It sounds funny, but he's not wrong. I mean, they're going to make that pass and break off, so hopefully you'll follow. If that doesn't work, they're going to make another pass and shoot off flares because they're trying to get your attention. And at that point, we can assume you're not on the right frequency, you're not monitoring guard, and it hasn't clicked yet. At some point, and this is why I really do encourage you, watch those YouTube videos. At some point, they may fire a burst across your nose, and they will talk about having authorization to fire. This is not a joke, and this is why we wanted to do this as a presentation, because luckily nobody has been shot down to this point, to my knowledge. But this is becoming increasingly common. People aren't paying attention. That TFRs pop up. Some of them are quite serious. And Kay, as we were just talking about, it's so easy to stay out of them. They're marked well in advance. We can get the briefing. We can see it on ForeFlight or WingX or Garmin Pilot. It's so easy to stay out of it. We just have a habit of not getting that pre-flight briefing, not doing the pre-flight planning we should be doing. And I suspect, Kay, anytime you'd fly with a student, you'd say, let's make sure we do that first, because we don't need a surprise when we're up in the sky.
Right. And you don't want that kind of surprise, you know. It's so important to get that information because it's readily available. And in addition to the pre-flight planning, it's also important for all of us to understand, you know, what do you do if you do see that fighter jet on your wingtip? And so I encourage all the viewers here to take a look at the intercept procedures in a little bit more detail, because if you don't, at least you're watching us right now talk about it, so it's not going to be a complete surprise. But you might be wondering, well, what is this fighter doing right now? They're circling over an airport, they're putting their landing gear down. Well, that should be a clue to you that they want you to land there. And you would know that if you took a look in the intercept procedures and spent, you know, I'm talking about 5 or 10 minutes. It won't take very long. Then if you ever get into that situation, it'll be a little bit more obvious. And in fact, the FAA and NORAD has kneeboard size pamphlets for you. And I keep that in my little, it's not a 3-ring, it's, what is it, 8 or 9 rings. Here's the, here's one that, in fact, Jamie, you were just talking about the intercept procedure before as far as what you should do. But look at the table there right below that graphic where it says the day intercept signals. That third row is what I just mentioned. You know, the fighter cruises over the airport, lowers the landing gears, overflies a runway in the direction of landing. They want you to land there. So, you know, study this page here, and there's a special procedure for nighttime. And then on the back of this knee board, which again you can print off, there's a little bit more detail on flight planning and what to do during flight, and some other references. If you're flying in the Washington, D.C. area, there's special procedures around DCA, that's Reagan Airport. You need to take that course in order to fly in that area. And so this knee board really has a lot of good information. So take a look at that.
Yeah, I think that graphic is actually especially important. If you can put that up for just one more second, Rebecca, that graphic on the bottom with the 30 nautical mile ring and then the 10 nautical mile ring inside, it's kind of telling you that's a no-go. So inside that 30 nautical mile radius, that's where they're doing the flyby, where they're trying to get you to land or depart the air. They're calling you on 121.5. They're doing everything they can to get you out, because if you get inside that 10 nautical mile ring, things get a lot more serious and you don't want to be there. One thing I will say, you know, Kay, you bring up an interesting point. That fighter may fly down a runway, and it may not be the destination you had in mind. Take the hint. If that fighter passes you and runs down that runway and they drop their gear and pull it up again, they want you to land on that runway in that direction. They're not asking if you would like to go someplace nearby. take that seriously. And, Pat, I think that's one of the challenges for pilots, because we get a plan in our head. And this is especially true of general aviation pilots who are doing leisure flying. I'm going from A to B. And even if the weather turns bad, I'm going A to B. And even if my engine starts running rough, I'm not landing here. I'm going from A to B. Sometimes it's hard for us to accept that the plan has just changed. And in this case, the plan is going to get pretty serious if we don't pay attention.
Yeah, plan continuation bias or mission mindset is what you're talking about. And it's just like, by golly, I'm going there. And we don't give thought to, well, what if? And it could be, as you said, a rough engine or wonky oil pressure or some, who knows what. Or, that F-16 practicing slow flight off your left wing. It could be any number of things.
I'm, as you know, Pat, because we've flown together and we've talked about it enough, I am a huge proponent of VFR flight following, because I almost always fly VFR. I use VFR flight following a lot. And I was flying out the Panhandle once towards Louisiana and flying past Pensacola. And which has a Navy base. And I got a call from ATC warning me that there was a flight of 4 F-18s off my left wing. And I can't tell you what a relief it was that as I noticed them, I realized, oh, they're not here for me. They're just passing through. But being on the right frequency, having a squawk code, they know what I'm doing. I know what's going on. They have a way of communicating. That makes all the difference. And Tiffany Sams is exactly right. That get there-itis will get you into trouble or worse. Now, Pat, I'm going to come back to you with Air J's question, because it's an interesting one. Does an in-flight emergency overrule a TFR? I'm going to say it depends on the type of TFR, but you probably shouldn't have been anywhere near it in the first place. What's your thought? I saw you. This is a first. This is great.
Well, I'm not sure that there's an easy answer to that one. I mean, if you said, well, you have to answer this in one word, then I would say probably, because the FARs say that you can deviate from any reg that you need to deviate from in order to end the flight safely. That said, if you've done something monumentally stupid that's put yourself in a position of having to declare an emergency, perhaps flying into weather that you didn't have the sense to turn around and fly back, away from, there may be some sort of consequence there. But if it was a legitimate, I'm on fire, or the engine just quit, or a real legitimate emergency. I've said this before, I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. So if it's a real legitimate emergency that I didn't put myself into because of something stupid I did, then I would think that would trump the TFR. But that's just an opinion, and I'm not.
I think that's a valid one, though, Pat. And we talked about there's various flavors. If I was flying over the top of AirVenture and I'm at 10,500 feet, and that TFR goes up to 10,000, and I happen to lose my engine right there, yeah, I'd make that Mayday call, and I'm going here because it's right beneath me, and they'll tell the air show performers to knock it off. They'll clear some space out for me. But if I'm inside that 30-mile ring of the Presidential TFR and I call Mayday that my engine's running rough, so I'm going to the primary airport inside the 10-mile ring, that would not be my choice. I'll take a cornfield over that one.
The way I look at it is that you can violate any federal aviation regulations, but when you get back on the ground, you better have a good reason. And you've got to be able to justify why you needed to violate. That's my litmus test. And
well, and this brings us to, there was that GA airplane at the beginning of June that inadvertently, totally innocently, but wrongly violated a presidential TFR, and President Biden actually had to be evacuated. The people who are protecting the president don't know what your situation is, and they don't know if you're telling the truth or not. So yeah, if it's not a VIP TFR, if it's something else, sure, I might try that. But seriously, if it's a presidential TFR, from the mindset of the person who's charged with protecting them, and you're heading for the primary airport, are they going to let that happen? I don't know. So that goes back to Pat's being carried by 12 or 6, or how many people carried it, I can't remember. But that is a serious issue that we have to think about. And part of why, and I really admire you for this, Pat, because I have the same attitude. Give these things a wide berth. Don't be in a position where you're going to have an emergency and that's your only out. Find a way around it. They published that TFR. You knew it was there before you took off, or you should have known it was there. And that should have been part of your flight planning. And Kay, well, we might fly through that Disney TFR. And that's a good example. If we actually had an emergency, that might be the place for us to go. But then again, it's only 3 miles wide. We could probably get someplace outside of it safely, don't you think?
Absolutely. A lot of the TFRs are really small. So yes, there are some situations in an emergency where you're running out of time, especially if you're at lower altitudes. But this is where it goes back to the pre-flight planning. You should have known where that TFR was, and you should not plan so that you are right at the edge of the circle or square or whatever the TFR shape is. You want to give some leeway, and you want to plan for emergencies too, and keep into account the altitudes. My neck of the woods, we've got a lot of mountains around here, and so you need to make sure that you have a way out. And if there is a TFR that's going to be in your way as part of your way out, then find another path or wait for that TFR to go away.
Pat, Sam Stokes asks a great question. We've been talking a lot about VFR, and I do that intentionally because most of us started out at least VFR and still do a lot of VFR flying. But if I'm IFR, if I'm flying on an IFI flight plan, I do have a lot more latitude with TFRs than I would as a VFR pilot, wouldn't I?
Yeah, I mean, if you're using flight following, even VFR, if you're using flight following, and I'll give this example. Fort Hood is kind of in central Texas, and there are restricted and prohibited areas all over the place, as you can imagine there. And there are some GA airports, non-tower GA airports, that are on the northern fringes, periphery of those restricted and prohibited airspaces. If you're talking to Gray Approach, which is the authority there, they are really, really good about giving you vectors to stay outside, and they'll take you right along the edge, but they'll keep you outside of it. You'll say turn 5 degrees right, and they'll keep you out of it. With regard to IFR stuff, if you're talking to ATC, they're going to keep you legal. You don't have to worry quite so much about that because they'll shepherd you around that. When you're talking about restricted and prohibited areas, if you are at point A and want to go to point B and you've got something like that in your way, talk to ATC. They may well let you fly through that, but I wouldn't do it without talking to someone. We were coming home from Sun and Fun a few years ago, and we had some weather issues, and we wanted to make it to Mobile before the weather got to us. And to do it with a good enough margin, we had to fly over Eglin Air Force Base, and there's all kinds of restricted and prohibited airspace around there. I just asked Eglin Approach, could we proceed direct to Mobile? And they said, sure, proceed direct to Mobile, right over the top of the Air Force Base through their special use airspace. So if you ask, you may get with regard to special use airspace. That is not necessarily the case with TFRs, although we've talked about the exceptions with sports stadiums and the Disney properties and some of those other, I'll call them lesser TFRs. They're all serious, they're all important, but some of them are, I'll call them lesser TFRs. They can still, though, result in the kind of certificate action that we talked about earlier, suspension, revocation, civil penalties, a 709 ride, all those things.
Yeah, that is one of the great byproducts of this discussion, I think, Pat, because while we're talking about TFRs, and it is a serious thing, because as we talked about, there's potential jail and fines and revocations and civil penalties. This is not a joke. You really do need to be aware of it. But it translates to our pre-flight planning for MOAs and restricted areas and prohibited areas and all the various types of airspace we have to deal with that, Kay, admittedly, we didn't have to years ago. There was a time when LAX had a different name, and Jimmy Stewart kept a Stinson there, and it was surrounded by apricot orchards. It was a different time, and you could just go anywhere. That's not the case now in Southern California, is it?
No, this is the busiest airspace in the world, and I know the topic today is on TFRs, but in general, you got to know that situational awareness about the airspace, and this is where it's really helpful to not just plan, do a thorough pre-flight planning, but also to communicate with ATC on flight following if you're VFR. IFR is a different story, but VFR around here, the flight following is not only encouraged. In some places, you have to have a squawk code before you even take off. Because they want you to have the flight following. And that's not because of TFRs or special use airspace. It's just because of the busy airspace. And there's a lot of different controlled, towered airports around here. And you are likely to take off from one and get right into the traffic pattern of another. So they insist on you having a squawk code before you even take off. So I highly recommend in any busy airspace in the world to ask for the flight following right on the ground. You don't have to wait until you get up in the air to try to get them. Try to get that code, and that will help you with the busy airspace and also the TFRs. If you are talking to someone with a discrete squawk code, you are less likely to violate airspace or TFRs.
I run into that here, Florida, where parts of Florida are really desolate. There's not much around. It's non-towered airports. There's nobody to talk to. But we also have airports along the coast, whether it's a Delta or a Charlie, where, there's clearance delivery. You can get VFR flight following before you've even left the ramp, so you're covered. It really does come down to our flight planning, because TFRs are just NOTAMs, notice to air mission. And we have every reason to want to know about them, and the FAA makes every effort to get us that information. So really, it's just a case of we ask. Russell's got a comment up here. Lately, with staffing shortages, we often cannot get flight following near Savannah, Georgia. I would believe that, and I have made flights, especially up in the Northeast, up in New York Center, where you just can't get it. It's not going to happen. But we can still do a fair amount of VFR flight planning, IFR flight planning before we leave the house, before we leave the FBO, when we really plan, make that phone call, log into the website, do whatever we need to do to gather solid information so we absolutely know what's going to occur on our flight, because there's still plenty of room to have some issues. But we don't want to wander into that TFR or the hot restricted area or an MOA that's actively being used where they really didn't want us there. Guys, I can't thank you enough for having this discussion. I really appreciate it. We've got a few minutes left here as we wrap things up, but I would like to take a moment and thank my compatriots, Pat and Kay, very much. 2 weeks ago, we did a presentation on how to be a good neighbor, noise abatement and that sort of thing. I was really looking forward to doing it. I was charged up. I was excited. Unfortunately, I was also infected with COVID. So that didn't work out real well. Kay and Pat, thank you very much. I saw the video and it worked out well. Those of you watching don't realize they had about a half an hour's notice that I wasn't going to be there with them. Thank you very much. I sincerely appreciate you all carrying the load for me like that.
Happy to do it, Jamie. Happy to do it. Hey, let me make just one point about flight following on the ground. There are Class Delta towers, and predominantly it's Class Delta we're talking about, that don't have the sophisticated equipment to allow them to assign you a squawk code on the ground and then seamlessly hand you off to ATC. There are several of them that I can think of just here in Texas where that's the case, one about 20 miles from where I'm at right now. So if you should be at one of those towers, you may not know it. Maybe you're a transient or something at that tower. But if you ask for flight following, the tower says, unable to do it, don't freak out. just ask them what's the approach control frequency in the area if you don't already know it. And once you're airborne, they'll tell you something about proceed on course or something like that, and then just go over and call approach control or center, as the case may be, and go ahead and get flight following that way. Just do it as if you were picking it up from in the air somewhere.
Pat, thanks for
And they can
mentioning
do that very quickly. You're right, Pat. I mean, I can depart a Class Delta airport, and I can be a mile out and just call and say frequency change requested. And they know why, because I just asked them about flight following. They'll give it to me, and I barely left the airport grounds, and now I'm on with approach, and everything's good. So you're absolutely right. Kay, do you have any special procedures in California in that densely packed airspace you've got? Do you guys have any special methods that you use?
The flight following is really, really recommended here, especially in the Los Angeles area. But as far as the comments from the individual in Savannah that said that I can't get flight following, that happens out here too. But that's more when you are in the practice area and you're going to another airport where there isn't a whole lot of airports along the way, and they're just busy. But when you are departing, particularly in the Los Angeles, the LA basin, they want you to have that discrete code, because you are likely to get into somebody's controlled air, some Delta airspace, because there are so many airports in such a small area with a lot of arrivals and departures from major airports like LAX and Burbank and Ontario. You got on all the directions. So the procedure really is from the ground is to tell them where you're going and get that discrete code and frequency before you take off. But in some other areas where, especially if you're going to be flying out of a non-towered field, like in a satellite airport, then it's to get up in the air and try to get the flight following as soon as possible. It really is to your benefit. They will help you navigate that airspace.
That's great insight. By the way, to the viewers, y'all seem to be all over the place geographically today, and I really enjoy that. Do me a favor, just pop in on your comment, put in your airport identifier. Mine is Golf India Foxtrot. Pat's, what's yours?
India Whiskey Sierra.
I like that place. Two putting greens. Okay, what's your home airport designator?
It's Charlie Romeo, Quebec.
I like that. So now everybody knows where to come see us. Absolutely. And remember, folks, there's an event coming up in July. I think it's pretty much public knowledge. It's called AirVenture. It happens in this little cheese curd corner of America called Wisconsin. You guys are going, aren't you?
Oh, yeah.
Yep. All week.
I have to stay in Florida. It's part of the work release program. I'm not allowed to leave. It's a thing.
But hey, as a matter of fact, though, Ask an Ambassador happens the Tuesday night of Oshkosh. So we got to figure out what we're going to do about that.
I believe we can make it happen because we can do anything. I'm past COVID, so we're good. What's that, Kay?
You might be solo that day if Pat and I are at Oshkosh, but we'll see.
Well, I do owe you since you covered for me last time, and I'll do an entire episode on the unbelievable beauty of East Texas and Southern California, and then you can both tell me how wrong I was afterwards about all the things I missed. We'll be back here Tuesday, July 12th, 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific. We've got the time zones in the middle. You know them. The Central Time Zone, 5 o'clock. No, 6 o'clock in Central, 5 o'clock in Mountain. We'll be right back here. We'll give you a heads up on Facebook to let you know we're going to be doing it, but you can always come back here. We really appreciate your participation. Thank you so much for all your comments. I love all these home airports. Just absolutely fantastic. I look forward to seeing you next time. Kay, do you have any parting words of wisdom you want to share with the folks watching tonight?
Plan, talk, and squawk. All right? Plan your routes, get your TFRs, know where all that stuff is, talk to ATC, get that frequency, monitored guard, and squawk on the discrete code. So plan, talk, and squawk.
Pat, you got anything to add to that?
Boy, I can't add to that. That was really good, Kay. I'm going to steal that.
I like it. And I will say, if you're monitoring guard 121.5 and you hear your end number and turn immediately or land here, you're going to have an adrenaline dump. It's going to happen. Your heart's going to go pitter-pat. Your head's going to be saying, what did I do wrong? Put all that aside, make that turn. Do the thing they're telling you to do right now. And as Pat says, you can be judged later by 12. Much better than being carried out by 6. Thanks, folks. We'll see you on July 12th right back here. I really appreciate it. And again, Kay and Pat, thank you for covering for me last time. You just did a great job. I appreciate it. Y'all have a wonderful night, and we'll see you again soon.
Good night.
Bye.